The frozen breath of Private James Mitchell hung in the air like a death shroud as he peered across the snow-laden Ardennes forest on the morning of December 16th, 1944. Something felt wrong. The German artillery, which had been silent for weeks, suddenly erupted in a thunderous symphony of destruction that shattered the dawn peace across 85 miles of the Belgian Luxembourg border. Mitchell dove into his foxhole just as the first shells began falling like metallic hail on the American positions. Around him, the 106th Infantry Division scrambled for cover, their faces etched with confusion and terror. They had been told this was a quiet sector, a place where green troops could get their feet wet and battle-weary veterans could catch their breath. The intelligence reports had been catastrophically wrong. Through the smoke and snow, shadows emerged from the forest. Not the scattered patrols they expected, but entire divisions of German soldiers advancing with the fury of desperate men. Alt! Wehrmacht had launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. 30 German divisions, including elite panzer units and battle-hardened SS troops, crashed into the American lines with the force of an avalanche. Sergeant Thomas Rodriguez of the 28th Infantry Division watched in horror as German panzer for tanks rolled through his position near Clairvaux, Luxembourg. His radio crackled with panicked reports from across the front. "They're everywhere," screamed a voice from the radio. "Request immediate reinforcement at St. Vith." Another pleaded. The carefully laid Allied defensive line was crumbling like ancient parchment. The forest that had seemed so peaceful just hours before now echoed with the roar of tank engines, the crack of rifles, and the screams of wounded men. German soldiers, many wearing American uniforms in a daring deception operation led by Otto Skorzany's commandos, infiltrated behind Allied lines, cutting communications and spreading chaos. Road signs were turned around, vital bridges were seized, and confusion reigned supreme. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, commanding the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, led his battle group in a lightning thrust toward the Meuse River. His tanks and armored vehicles carved through the American defenses like a sword through silk, leaving destruction in their wake. The surprise was complete, the execution devastating. Hitler's bold plan to recreate his 1940 Blitzkrieg success in France seemed within reach, as snow continued to fall, blanketing the battlefield in an eerie white silence broken only by the sounds of war. The American forces found themselves fighting for their very survival. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and it would prove to be the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought by the United States Army. The stakes could not have been higher. The fate of Western Europe hung in the balance, decided by young men freezing in foxholes carved from frozen ground, fighting an enemy that had caught them completely off guard. The German offensive had achieved tactical surprise beyond their wildest expectations. But the true test lay ahead. Could they maintain their momentum against increasingly desperate American resistance? Or would this prove to be Hitler's final fatal miscalculation? The second day of the offensive dawned with the Ardennes forest. Transformed into a hellscape of burning vehicles and frozen corpses, Captain William Hayes of the 7th Armored Division received urgent orders to hold St. Vith at all costs, a small Belgian town that had suddenly become the fulcrum upon which the entire battle would turn. If St. Vith fell, the German advance would have a clear path to the Meuse River and beyond. Hayes surveyed his makeshift defensive positions with growing dread. His men were a mixture of battle-hardened veterans and terrified replacements who had never seen combat. They were outnumbered 3-1, low on ammunition, and completely cut off from higher command. The German 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, was closing in from 3 directions like a steel noose. According to reports from the Imperial War Museum, Allied forces in the Ardennes consisted primarily of American troops, some new and inexperienced, others exhausted, a fatal combination that the Germans exploited ruthlessly. The fog of war had descended completely over the American command structure. Radio communications were sporadic at best, and many units had no idea where their neighboring forces were positioned. The small town of Bastogne, held by the 101st Airborne Division under Acting Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, found itself completely surrounded by German forces. The paratroopers, who had been rushed to the Ardennes from their rest areas in France, arrived without proper winter equipment or adequate supplies. Yet they dug in with the tenacity that would make them legendary. German panzer columns rolled through the forests like mechanical beasts, their tracks churning the snow into bloody slush. The elite Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Division pushed forward with fanatical determination. Knowing that this was likely their last chance to change the tide of the war, behind them came regular Wehrmacht units, many filled with young soldiers, who had known nothing but war for their entire adult lives. Private First Class Robert Chen, a medic with the 9th Armored Division, crawled through no man's land between the opposing forces, trying to reach wounded American soldiers. The temperature had dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Many wounded men were literally freezing to death before they could be evacuated. Chen's hands were so cold he could barely feel them, but he continued his grim work, knowing that every minute counted. The German advance began to slow as American resistance stiffened. Individual acts of heroism emerged from the chaos, small units holding crossroads against overwhelming odds. Tank destroyers knocking out German panzers from concealed positions, and ordinary soldiers performing extraordinary feats of courage. The American forces were bending but not breaking. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, worked feverishly to coordinate a response to the German offensive. Intelligence reports flooded in from across the front, painting a picture of disaster and confusion. Some units had been completely overrun. Others were fighting desperate holding actions. And still others had lost all contact with higher command. As night fell on December 17th, the true scope of the German offensive became clear. This was not a local attack or a spoiling operation. This was Hitler's last great gamble, desperate attempt to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. The weather was on the German side, with heavy cloud cover preventing Allied air support from intervening. The Battle of the Bulge was far from over, and the outcome remained terrifyingly uncertain. By December 20th, 1944, the strategic crossroads town of Bastogne had become the eye of the hurricane. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe and his 101st Airborne Division found themselves completely encircled by German forces, cut off from all supply lines and facing annihilation. The town's 7 roads made it a crucial junction that both sides desperately needed to control. The German ultimatum arrived under a white flag on December 22nd. 4 German officers approached the American lines with a formal demand for surrender, warning that without capitulation, the town would be subjected to total destruction. McAuliffe's response would become one of the most famous in military history. A single word: nuts. When the German officers asked for clarification, Colonel Joseph Harper translated, "Tell them to go to hell." Inside the besieged perimeter, conditions were desperate. Medical supplies had run critically low, and Chaplain Francis Sampson performed field surgery with kitchen knives when proper instruments weren't available. The wounded lay in improvised aid stations carved from bombed-out basements, their groans mixing with the constant sound of artillery shells falling on the town. Ammunition was rationed so severely that men were limited to 10 rounds each. Staff Sergeant William Garner of Easy Company, 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment, led a patrol through the frozen streets of Bastogne, searching for German infiltrators. The paratroopers had transformed the town into a fortress, with every building becoming a potential strongpoint. Church bells had been melted down to make ammunition, and civilians huddled in cellars while the battle raged above their heads. The German forces pressing against Bastogne included elements of the 2nd Panzer Division and the Panzer Lehr Division, some of the Wehrmacht's finest units. They launched repeated assaults against the American perimeter, each attack breaking like waves against granite cliffs. The paratroopers, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with the desperate courage of men who knew surrender meant death. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Shapowis, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, organized the defense of the town's southeastern approaches. His men had constructed interlocking fields of fire using every available weapon, from rifles and machine guns to captured German Panzerfausts. When German tanks broke through the outer defenses, individual soldiers stalked them through the ruins with bazookas and satchel charges. The siege reached its climax on December 23rd, when the weather finally cleared, allowing Allied aircraft to resume operations. Transport planes began dropping desperately needed supplies into the shrinking defensive perimeter. Though many loads fell into German hands, fighter bombers struck at German positions surrounding the town, their machine guns and rockets providing temporary relief to the embattled defenders. Technical Sergeant Vernon Hagler, a radio operator with the divisional headquarters, maintained sporadic contact with outside forces despite constant German jamming efforts. His reports painted a grim picture of the situation inside Bastogne. Ammunition nearly exhausted, medical supplies critically low, and casualties mounting by the hour. Yet morale remained surprisingly high among the defenders, who had developed an almost mystical belief in their ability to hold out. The German noose continued to tighten around Bastogne, but the paratroopers refused to yield. They had transformed a sleepy Belgian market town into a symbol of American determination and resilience. Every street corner became a battlefield, every building a fortress. The outcome of the entire Ardennes offensive might well depend on whether these exhausted, outnumbered soldiers could continue to hold their ground against impossible odds. As Christmas Eve approached, both sides prepared for what many believed would be the final assault on Bastogne. The question was no longer whether the town could be held, but whether relief would arrive in time to prevent its complete destruction. General George Smith Patton Jr. stood before his assembled commanders on December 19, 1944, his ivory-handled pistols gleaming in the dim light of the Third Army headquarters. The man known as Old Blood and Guts had just performed what many considered a military miracle, pivoting his entire army 90 degrees north in 48 hours to strike at the German flank in the Ardennes. "Gentlemen," Patton declared with characteristic bravado, "the Krauts have stuck their heads in a meat grinder, and I'm going to turn the handle." His 4th Armored Division, led by Major General Hugh Gaffey, was already racing through the frozen countryside toward the besieged town of Bastogne, 60 miles away. The relief expedition faced treacherous roads, brutal weather, and determined German resistance at every crossroads. Tank Commander Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien, driving his Sherman Tank Fury through the snow-covered hills south of Bastogne, could hear the distant rumble of artillery growing louder with each mile. His crew gunner Corporal Danny Walsh, loader Private First Class Tony Ricci, and radio operator Corporal James Kim maintained tense silence as they approached the German defensive lines protecting the approaches to the besieged town. The German forces arrayed against Patton's advance included crack units that had been positioned to prevent exactly this kind of relief operation. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division and elements of the Führer Grenadier Brigade created a defensive network of anti-tank guns, machine gun nests, and minefields that turned every village into a fortress. Each mile toward Bastogne would be purchased with American blood. Combat engineer Sergeant First Class David Martinez worked frantically to clear German mines from the main road leading north. His sappers advanced on their bellies through the snow, probing with bayonets for the deadly Teller mines that could destroy an entire tank. Behind them, the relief column waited impatiently, precious hours ticking away while the defenders of Bastogne fought for their lives. The weather remained brutally cold, the temperatures plummeting to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. Frostbite became as dangerous an enemy as German bullets, and medics treated more cases of exposure than combat wounds. Tank engines froze solid, if shut down for more than 30 minutes, and machine guns jammed when moisture in the mechanism turned to ice. Lieutenant Charles Parker of the 10th Armored Division led his tank platoon in a desperate assault on the village of Essenois, just 4 miles south of Bastogne. German Panzerfaust teams hidden in the rubble knocked out 2 of his Shermans before his remaining tanks could clear the settlement. The advance continued, leaving burning vehicles and dead soldiers scattered along the icy roads. As December 26 dawned, Patton's spearhead finally made contact with the Bastogne perimeter. First Lieutenant Charles Bogus of the 37th AC Battalion became the first relief force soldier to shake hands with the embattled paratroopers. "How are you, Mac?" asked the paratrooper. "Gee, I am mighty glad to see you, Bogus," replied, his voice cracking with emotion. The relief of Bastogne marked a turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. But the fighting was far from over. German forces continued to press their attacks, knowing that their last chance for victory was slipping away. The weather began to clear, allowing Allied air power to return to the battlefield with devastating effect. Hundreds of German tanks and vehicles forced to move in daylight became targets for swarms of fighter bombers. Patton's Third Army had accomplished the impossible. The cost had been enormous. Hundreds of American soldiers lay frozen in the snow between Bastogne and the relief forces' starting positions. The German offensive had been blunted but not broken, and the final outcome of Hitler's desperate gamble remained uncertain. Battle for the Ardennes would continue for 3 more weeks of savage fighting in the worst weather conditions imaginable. The small crossroads town of Malmedy became synonymous with one of the war's most notorious atrocities. On December 17, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper's 1st SS Panzer Regiment had been advancing rapidly through American lines when they encountered a convoy from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion near the village of Ardennes, just south of Malmedy. Battery B of the artillery unit, commanded by Captain Roger Mills, had been retreating westward when they ran into Peiper's advance guard. The Americans, consisting mostly of support personnel with limited combat training, were quickly overwhelmed by the SS Panzer Grenadiers and their accompanying tanks. Private First Class Theodore Palou watched in horror as German soldiers herded over 100 American prisoners into a snow-covered field. What happened next would become one of the most documented war crimes of the European theater. Without warning or provocation, SS soldiers opened fire on the unarmed American prisoners with machine guns and pistols. Men fell screaming into the blood-stained snow while their comrades scrambled desperately for cover. Private Warren Schmidt feigned death, lying motionless among the corpses while German soldiers walked among the bodies, shooting any who showed signs of life. Technical Sergeant William Merrican, despite being wounded in the initial massacre, managed to escape into the nearby woods along with approximately 30 other survivors. For hours, they could hear the sounds of German soldiers executing wounded Americans who had survived the initial shooting. The SS troops showed no mercy, even to men who were clearly dying from their wounds. The news of the Malmedy massacre spread rapidly through American units across the Ardennes front, transforming the character of the battle. Where American soldiers had previously been willing to accept German surrenders routinely, many now fought. With a savage intensity born of outrage and revenge, the rules of warfare had been violated in the most brutal fashion possible, and American soldiers responded accordingly. Sergeant First Class Robert Bradley of the 30th Infantry Division discovered the massacre site 3 days later when American forces retook the area. The frozen bodies of 84 American soldiers lay scattered across the field, many with obvious signs of execution-style wounds. Medical examiners later determined that some victims had been beaten with rifle butts before being shot, while others showed evidence of having been burned alive. The massacre was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of SS brutality during the offensive. At Stavlet, members of Peiper's battle group murdered over 100 Belgian civilians, including women and children, in a series of systematic executions. The village of Houffalize witnessed similar atrocities as SS troops vented their frustration on helpless non-combatants. Captain Henry Lemaire, Belgian resistance leader operating behind German lines, documented numerous instances of SS brutality against both American prisoners and Belgian civilians. His reports, transmitted by clandestine radio to Allied intelligence, painted a picture of systematic terror designed to intimidate local populations and demoralize American forces. The SS had abandoned any pretense of following international law. Word of these atrocities reached the highest levels of Allied command within hours. General Dwight Eisenhower personally ordered that all evidence be preserved for future war crimes tribunals. While battlefield commanders struggled with the Practical implications of fighting an enemy that had abandoned civilized conduct? The Geneva Convention seemed like ancient history when faced with SS brutality. Private Kenneth Johnson of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, carried a photograph of the Malmedy victims in his helmet liner for the remainder of the campaign. Like thousands of other American soldiers, he had been fundamentally changed by the knowledge that surrender might mean execution rather than imprisonment. The battle had taken on a darker or personal character that would influence American conduct for the remainder of the war. The Malmedy massacre became a rallying cry for American forces throughout the remaining weeks of the Battle of the Bulge. Remember Malmedy echoed across foxholes and command posts, transforming a tactical defeat into a powerful motivation for ultimate victory. The SS had succeeded only in hardening American resolve and ensuring that their own defeat would be absolute and unforgiving. By December 23, 1944, the German offensive had reached its high-water mark. But the signs of impending failure were multiplying like cracks in winter ice. General Heinz Guderian, chief of the German General Staff, had warned Hitler that the Wehrmacht lacked the fuel reserves necessary to sustain the offensive beyond its initial phase. Those warnings were now proving prophetically accurate as German tank columns ground to a halt with empty fuel tanks mere miles from their objectives. Major Johann Weber, commanding a company of King Tiger tanks from the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, surveyed his immobilized vehicles with growing desperation. His mighty tanks, each weighing nearly 70 tons and theoretically capable of destroying any Allied armor, sat silent and useless in the snow-covered forest near Celles, Belgium. The fuel convoy that should have reached them 3 days earlier had been destroyed by Allied fighter bombers, leaving his proud unit stranded and vulnerable. The weather, which had initially favored the German offensive by grounding Allied aircraft, finally began to clear on December 23rd. Within hours, the skies over the Ardennes were filled with Allied planes that had been waiting for this moment for a week. Hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs descended upon German columns like mechanical birds of prey, their machine guns and rockets turning the snow-covered roads into graveyards of burning metal. Flight Lieutenant Robert Tex Thompson, piloting his P-47 over the Ardennes, counted more than 50 German vehicles destroyed in a single strafing run near Hafeliz. The concentrated German forces, which had been an advantage during the initial breakthrough, now became a liability as Allied pilots found target-rich environments wherever they looked. Entire panzer divisions were being reduced to smoking scrap metal from the air. The German 2nd Panzer Division, which had advanced farther west than any other unit and actually reached the outskirts of Dinant on the Meuse River, found itself completely cut off and surrounded. Major Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the division's operations officer, realized with growing horror that his unit was trapped in a deadly salient with no hope of reinforcement or resupply. The division that had come closest to achieving Hitler's objectives would be completely destroyed within 48 hours. General Courtney Hodges, commanding the First Army, coordinated the American counteroffensive with the methodical precision of a master chess player moving his pieces into position. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, battle-tested veterans of Normandy and Market Garden, led the assault from the north while Patton's Third Army maintained pressure from the south. The German salient was being squeezed. From all directions, Colonel Bruce Clark, commanding Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division, recaptured the vital crossroads of St. Vith after 3 days of brutal house-to-house fighting. His Sherman tanks, supported by infantry from the 82nd Airborne, methodically cleared German strongpoints that had been established during the initial offensive. Each building became a battlefield, each street a killing ground. Retreat began on December 26th. Initially as a tactical withdrawal, but quickly deteriorating into a rout as American forces pressed their advantage. Thousands of German soldiers, many of them teenagers who had been pressed into service, during the Wehrmacht's final desperate mobilization, surrendered rather than face the American advance. The vaunted German military machine was revealing itself to be a hollow shell. Supply Sergeant Frank Kowalski of the 4th Infantry Division discovered abandoned. German equipment scattered throughout the forest, Tiger tanks with full ammunition, loads but empty fuel tanks, artillery pieces, with their crews simply vanished. and supply dumps hastily abandoned with winter clothing and medical supplies desperately needed by American forces. The German logistics system, already strained beyond capacity, finally collapsed completely as 1944 drew to a close. The Battle of the Bulge was entering its final phase, a German offensive, which had begun with such promise, and achieved such stunning initial success, was collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. Hitler's last gamble had failed, and the price of that failure would be measured in thousands of young lives lost in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. January 25, 1945, marked the official end of the Battle of the Bulge as German forces completed their withdrawal to their original starting positions. The cost of Hitler's final gamble had been catastrophic. The Wehrmacht had suffered over 100,000 casualties and lost irreplaceable equipment that could never be replaced. The German war machine, already stretched to its breaking point, had been shattered beyond repair. Captain William Holbrook of the 4th Armored Division stood among the ruins of Huffelise, Belgium, surveying a landscape that resembled the surface of an alien world. The small town had changed hands multiple times during the 6-week battle, and now nothing remained but rubble and the twisted metal of destroyed vehicles. Snow continued to fall, covering the evidence of destruction with a pristine white blanket that seemed to mock the violence that had occurred beneath it. The human cost of the battle was staggering beyond comprehension. American casualties totaled over 89,000 men, 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing. According to historical documentation from the Liberation Route, the Battle of the Bulge was the costliest operation ever fought by the U.S. Army. 10,733 American soldiers were killed and 42,316 wounded. Each statistic represented a family destroyed, dreams shattered, future stolen by the cruelty of war. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, the SS officer whose battle group had committed the Malmedy massacre, found himself leading the remnants of his once proud regiment in a desperate retreat through the same forests where he had advanced with such confidence 6 weeks earlier. His King Tiger tanks, which had seemed invincible during the initial breakthrough, now lay abandoned throughout the Ardennes, victims of fuel shortages and mechanical breakdowns rather than enemy action. Medic Corporal Sarah Martinez, one of the few women serving near the front lines, worked tirelessly in field hospitals that had been overwhelmed by the flood of casualties from both sides. She had treated German and American wounded side by side, finding that pain and suffering recognized no national boundaries. The young faces of soldiers from both armies would haunt her dreams for decades to come. The strategic consequences of the German defeat were immediately apparent to military leaders on both sides. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the German High Command, admitted privately that the Wehrmacht no longer possessed the strength to mount meaningful resistance on the Western Front. The reserves that had been committed to the Ardennes offensive represented Germany's last mobile striking force. Their destruction meant that the Reich's final collapse was now only a matter of time. Private First Class Johnny Rodriguez, a replacement soldier who had arrived during the battle's final phase, walked through the abandoned German positions near Bastogne with a mixture of awe and revulsion. The evidence of the Wehrmacht's desperation was everywhere: child soldiers who had died clutching weapons they barely knew how to use, elderly Volkssturm militia members who should have been home with their grandchildren, and regular Wehrmacht soldiers who had fought with the courage of men defending their homeland. General Dwight Eisenhower toured the battlefield in early February, accompanied by war correspondents who documented the aftermath of the largest battle in American military history. The Supreme Allied Commander recognized that the German offensive, despite its initial tactical success, had actually accelerated the end of the war by consuming Germany's last strategic reserves in a desperate gamble that had failed completely. The psychological impact of the battle extended far beyond its immediate tactical consequences. American forces had proven to themselves and the world that they could not only absorb a massive surprise attack, but ultimately emerge victorious through sheer determination and superior logistics. The citizen soldiers of the United States had met the Wehrmacht's best units in combat and prevailed through courage, ingenuity, and an unshakable belief in their cause, As spring returned to the Ardennes forest, wildflowers began growing among the abandoned foxholes and tank holes that would remain for decades as silent testimony to the battle. The trees that had witnessed such terrible violence began producing new leaves, offering hope that life would ultimately triumph over death. The Battle of the Bulge was over, but its lessons about the price of freedom and the courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances would endure forever.